And the amazing thing about tea is that for the 45 minutes that my wonderful panel are going to debate it, we could just dedicate the whole 45 minutes to just one simple part of the whole subject, because there's so many different facets to it. Just to give a small taster, I'm hoping that tonight we will cover, first of all, the fact that tea has basically changed the world. It has created incredible inspiration and beautiful works of art, from poetry to paintings, ceramics, etc. And not just in the East, in places like Japan and China, but also in the West. Then, on top of that, it has been a tremendous force for change. It has caused wars across the world. It has been a rallying point for people, for Women's Lib, for the Temperance Society, the anti-slavery movement. And even today, tea is still a great focus for trying to change the lot of people who actually produce tea, looking at questions like global warming and the minimum wage and all sorts of different aspects. So every time we take a cup of tea, we're actually making a political statement at the same time, even today. But we could ignore all of that and spend the whole evening talking about tea itself. Tea is like wine, and you have to be a connoisseur once you really get into the finer details of drinking tea. The true experts, of which all four people here, not myself, are, really understand everything from the climate to the soil to the culture of tea and where it's grown, to the methods of actually farming the tea, how the tea leaves are then produced, how they're marketed and sold. So this in itself, I mean, there are a myriad different types of tea that we could talk about. Then again, we could just completely ignore all of that and go on to another subject of tea, which everybody in Britain feels very, very strongly about, which is how do you drink yours? And people feel, if I am a tea bag drinker, am I going to be judged accordingly? Or am I really a loose leaf person? And do I put milk in before or after? There are so many different aspects that we can talk about, and I'm hoping that my brilliant panel are actually going to cover all of these aspects. There is only one area of tea that we are definitely not going to cover tonight, and it's banned, even from questions, which is herbal teas. We're not going to talk about them because they're not real teas. Even though you may love them, I'm sorry. So I'm going to, without more ado, I'm going to carry on and actually introduce the panel for you. So we start at the end with Tim Duffy. Now, for those who don't know Tim, he is somebody who first became really captivated, I suspect, by tea some 20 years ago when he was living in Japan. And he became really so interested that he started visiting people who grew tea. First presumably in Japan, and then he started venturing further afield into China. And gradually this grew up into being places like Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka. Until in 1999 he started importing tea in this country, and then set up as a co-founder with Alex Fraser, East Teas, which is here at Borough, which he then followed with Postcard Teas, which is another wonderful tea supplier, just off Bond Street. And they both companies specialise in very fine quality loose leaf tea. And Tim, correct me if I said anything wrong. Yes. Then we move on to Nick, Nick Kilby, who's next door to Tim. Nick comes from tea from a very different angle, though he also is a great lover of tea. I think everybody here is a great lover of tea. Nick has been working in the tea industry for 30 years, and he started, for many of those years he worked with Tetley Tea. He then, in 2006, set up with another colleague from Tetley Tea, Louise Cheadle, Tea Pigs. Now, Nick's angle for tea is actually to do with the sales and marketing, the commercial side. Is that correct? Yes. And so he and Louise saw a gap in the market for basically what they describe as high-end tea, but which is sold in what they describe as tea temples, which is a particular design for tea bag. And the company has really grown very rapidly. It's been proved to be very popular. there have, one of the problems with small companies is actually getting funding, and Tim and Louise managed to get funding from Tata, who were basically funding small new businesses, one of which is theirs, and Tata own Tetley Teas. So there is a link going through, but not in actually what you do. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Then we go to Jane Pettigrew, who rather cheekily said actually she's known as Petty Brew. Now Jane is, when I first saw that Jane was on the panel, everybody I spoke to said, "Oh, Jane!" Whoa! Because she's a fantastic tea historian, and she's an author of 15 books on tea, including a social history of tea. But not only does she teach about tea, she conducts tea masterclasses, she trains tea sommeliers, and she acts as a tea consultant to the business, basically. Yeah. And her book, Tea Classified, which I actually think for any tea enthusiast has to be on your bookshelf, is widely used by people like Twining. Is this working? Yeah. And just to explain how wonderful she is, she was voted Best Tea Educator at the World Tea Awards last year in California. So that really says something. Then, just to add the final sort of piquant dose to our mixture, we've got Sarah Roberts. And Sarah is another mover and shaker. She's the Executive Director of the Ethical Tea Partnership. And this, otherwise known as the ETP for ease, was formed in 1997. And it brings together now around 40 international tea buyers, trading and retail companies. And they've all got together because they want to create a thriving tea industry which is socially just and environmentally sustainable. And to this end, particularly under Sarah's guidance, they're running a variety of programs which are designed to address some of the underlying issues which are holding back sustainability of the tea sector, from low wages and marginal livelihoods, and also climate change is another issue they're trying to deal. So you now know who your panel is, but I want the panel to know who you are. So I'm going to ask you a few questions and you have to raise your hands and answer. So the first one is, how many of you regularly use tea bags? Hands up, admit. Ooh, so, well, it must be about 90%, are we agreed? Yeah, roughly. Now, who also or solely uses loose leaf tea? Oh, well, that's very good. That's probably, well, roughly nearly the same. I would say it's about 85%. Now, who loves builder's tea? This is very unusual. You're not representative of the great British population. It's a tiny number of people. And who drinks really unusual teas, such as oolong or Chinese white or green teas? About 50 to 60%, I would say, to guess. And lastly, who adds milk to their tea? Yeah? Okay, we've got about 45%? Yes, okay. Right, without more ado, now that I know who you are, we're going to start with the actual debate. And so remember to save up your questions and wave your arms around at the end, and I'll try and get to everybody. We have about 15 minutes at the end to do questions. So, I thought that maybe we should put tea into context. So I thought I'd start with Jane, as being the absolute expert, and ask her, how important does she feel that tea is to British life, and why?
That is such a big question. It is absolutely crucial to British life. We turn to tea for just about any kind of occasion, for celebration, commiseration, on your own, with a group of friends. I always feel that tea brings people together in an atmosphere of sharing, peace. You know, it's a very peaceful drink, very zen drink. But it started 365 odd years ago. Took a while to become the mainstream drink because it was so expensive. But it did have a huge effect at that time on the way we behaved. It influenced the furniture that we brought into this country. We needed tables, we needed porcelains and teapots to drink our tea from. It eventually affected the design of our houses because the ladies in the family wanted a withdrawing room in which they could drink their tea while the men were still being pretty drunk and noisy around the dining table. And so we have drawing rooms today because of that. It then affected politics, taxes. It's meant we went to war with China in 1839 over opium and tea. It meant that the American War of Independence happened because they didn't approve of our taxes. So they had what they call the Boston Tea Party, which was no tea party at all, but just filled Boston Harbour with chest loads of tea. So all sorts of underlying narrative to the story, which has affected everybody's lives, right through to today, where it is absolutely part of our lives. And I think, Nick, you always say that if tea was not in Britain, we would just collapse.
Absolutely.
We would just not exist. How could we go on?
So Nick, do you want to describe a little bit, particularly with your work maybe at Tetley's as well, how you think tea affects British society?
Yeah, so going on that sort of, what if we didn't have tea, almost think of it, if we had a non-tea day, like every product seems to have something a day, a special sausage day, pie day, there are tea days even, but imagine a day without tea and how this country would actually manage, and it would be really, really difficult. People wouldn't get up and get out to work, they wouldn't survive at work, and then they just wouldn't be able to do anything. There are so many things, as Jane says, that people come together over a cup of tea. It helps people recover from operations and upsets and things like that, and just such a convivial drink. So it's also worth saying it's not just in this country. It is worldwide, and it's amazing that, and probably even more so in countries where alcohol is less prevalent, tea is absolutely central to the culture of those countries. But coming back to this country, we drink a hell of a lot of tea, 165 million cups every day. Everyone talks about us being a coffee culture now. We're not. We only drink about 70 million cups of coffee. So it is there all the time. And I think the other thing about tea, it's such a universal drink in the country. Everybody drinks tea. And it almost back in the day we used to say it's the cleaning lady drinks tea all the way up to the Queen. And actually probably still, whichever way you want to say, builder's tea is the analogy of the everyday tea these days. But yeah, everybody pretty much drinks tea in this country. There's very few people who would not put their hand up at some stage that I don't drink tea during the year.
So the next question really is, do you think that people really know how tea is actually produced? And maybe I'll go to Tim for that, actually.
No, I don't think they do at all. I think one of the problems is because it's hidden in the bag most of the time. People's relationship with tea changes. The moment it becomes loose leaf, you have to make it and you start to have a different kind of relationship to it. I think also going back just a little bit, Britain's relationship is very interesting because I'm doing a book with Jane and researching on it, and there's very little evidence that the Chinese actually invented black tea as we know it today. There are some great Chinese black teas. They tend to come later, in the later 19th century, and are actually in one sense a reaction against the teas that are being made in India. So when tea goes to India, they originally try and get both, or they stole Chinese tea seeds, or Robert Fortune appropriated them, but also they brought over Chinese labourers to work at some of the early tea plantations, and it didn't work out very well. So the mechanicalization that happened to tea in the sort of mid 1830s, 40s, 50s, Jane probably knows more about this than I do, creates the kind of black tea that we know. And black tea is about 70% of the world's tea, 60-70%. So the dominant type of tea is black tea around the world. And where I work, which is mainly in Asia, people refer to black tea as English tea. So even if you're in China and you're drinking a black Chinese tea, they may still refer to it as English tea. It's quite bizarre.
So can we just understand actually what happens when tea is harvested? And I wonder if we should take two different types of tea just as an illustration. So I thought actually, Sarah, if you talk first of all maybe about African teas and how they are produced, and then we might go over to say a really tiny Japanese tea maker or something like that to compare how they're produced.
I'll probably hand back quite quickly on the technical aspects of how you produce tea, because that's not the world I come from. I'm from outside the tea trade originally, and I run the Ethical Tea Partnership. But it is such an amazing crop, actually. I've never really thought about tea much until I took on the job. I didn't know where it was produced. I mean, it's probably worth asking, where do you think tea is actually grown?
Does everybody know
No,
where
do you know
most
that-
tea is produced?
Sri Lanka? India? China?
All wrong.
Well, all right,
All
but
right.
they're all right.
See,
But
I
I
don't
think
know.
there's also a huge amount of the tea that comes into the UK in particular comes from East Africa. And I think going back to the history, I mean, it is a very colonial crop in terms of what we drink. So there's all the history in China and all the green tea that's always been drunk that side of the world. But the history of the black tea is driven by the British interest in tea. As you say, there's this incredible story of the British East India Company, when they were losing their monopoly on trade from China, actually paying this botanist to go into China, totally illegal for a foreigner to be in the interior of China at that time, and steal tea plants, get them over to India so they could start a sector in India and break that monopoly and make more money. And then you have the history, then you have the whole, spread of Scottish and English young men going out to the Assamese jungle, creating all these estates. Then it moves into Sri Lanka, and then it goes into Africa as well. I do a lot of work in Malawi at the moment, and again, that history there is of Chinese tea plants arriving in Malawi via Scottish missionaries from the Royal Edinburgh Botanic Gardens. You still have these big plantations which are run on very hierarchical lines in places like India and Africa, but then you've got the spread of the whole smallholder sector in places like Kenya, which has been incredibly successful. So it's a crop that's had an amazing impact on the world, actually. But in terms of what you do to the leaves and the CTC and orthodox and all that, I'm going to pass that on.
Just to get an idea of the difference in terms of tea production and what happens to what you're actually going to drink at the end.
Okay, so despite the ideas way back that green tea came from one type of plant and black tea came from another, scientists and botanists gradually realised that all teas are made from the same plant, which is the Camellia sinensis, the Chinese camellia, and that it's manufacturing methods that actually make the different types: green, white, oolong, black, yellow, and dark. Dark tea categories are the pu'er teas. Some of you, I'm sure, are drinking pu'er to reduce your cholesterol and lose weight and all the other things that it's supposed to do for you. But it's the manufacturing processes that actually make a green tea as opposed to a black tea. So the tea is picked. You always start off with the same raw material. It's picked either by hand or by shear pluckers or by mechanical harvesters of some kind, in some countries by massive great tractors. And then the tea is taken to the factory or your kitchen. You can make tea in your kitchen if you know what you're doing. And to make black tea, I'll pass on to Tim in a moment, or Nick, to talk about whites and greens. But to make black tea, the first thing we do is allow the leaves to what we call wither, which means we let them lie around to reduce the water content by about 35%, and that can take up to 20 hours, so it's usually done through the night. And then when the leaves have become a little bit dried and they've started to slightly change colour and start to smell a little bit appley in the factory, the tea is broken down. The leaves are rolled or cut in order to bring the juices from within the leaf onto the surface of the leaves, because then when the juices have been brought out, they will start oxidizing with oxygen in the air, and it's the oxidation process that turns the green leaf from green to black and develops the aroma that you would recognize from a black tea and the flavor that you would recognize. And it's a natural chemical process, exactly the same as when you cut an apple or a pear and the flesh changes color quite quickly. So that's oxidation. And so once we've made that, once we've provoked that oxidation, we let it go on until we feel that the tea's reached the right level of oxidation, when it's got really quite dark brown. Then we've got to stop the oxidation by actually applying heat. You always stop oxidation by applying heat. And in this case, the tea goes into great big ovens for about 20 minutes or so, and it comes out dry, and mixture of big bits, small bits, bits of fibre, bits of stalk, large bits of leaf, small bits of leaf, particles of dust, and that all has to be sorted out into different size pieces so that when you blend tea or brew tea, you actually have uniform size pieces. Otherwise you can't brew it successfully, you can't blend it successfully. And that's about it. So shall I pass to Tim to make us some green tea, or Nick? Maybe Nick can do oolongs or...
Shall I go in the middle? Yeah. I won't do oolong. No, we do a very, very simple explanation of black and green tea. And in fact, probably 15 years ago, if you spoke to someone in the UK about green tea, they would have thought you were joking, or they thought it was something you drank on St. Patrick's Day or something. But now a lot of people are familiar with green tea, but they're not necessarily familiar, as you say, that it comes from the same plant. And Jane's given a very good description of how you make black tea. Also the analogy, and we use this analogy a lot, of like slicing an apple and leaving it out, it starts to go brown. Pick a leaf off a tree, it will go brown eventually. And that's what's basically happening with the tea leaf when it's going to be a black tea. And a black tea ends up being a little bit, we describe it like a dried fruit. So imagine an apricot, and you dry it out, it's quite bitter, quite harsh, very strong in its actual flavour. Whereas a green tea, and Tim will explain perhaps how the green tea doesn't oxidise as much, is more like a fresh fruit, a fresh apricot, which has a much lighter, more delicate flavour. So that tends to be the way we would describe things from green tea to black tea. The process of making green tea is a simplified process of making tea in a way. It's the oxidisation process doesn't take place to the same extent. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very good. I can end there. I mean, Jane talked about you need a heat process to stop it developing oxidation potential. So if you're making very simple Chinese black tea, you'd use a wok. You may wither it before, sometimes for a long time. And the most famous Chinese green tea Longjing is essentially completely prepared in a wok. First of all, you're de-enzyming it and stopping the oxidation. Then you're shaping it and drying it. Most tea needs about 3 to 5% moisture left in the leaf to keep it stable so it doesn't go off over time. My favorite category of tea is oolong tea, which is produced really in a very small, almost triangle in Fujian and then Taiwan and Guangdong. And there you lightly promote oxidation by tossing the leaves usually onto either a bamboo tray or in a bamboo sort of roller drum, and where the leaf, usually on the edge, hits the bamboo, it starts to oxidize. You control that oxidation and then you heat treat it to stop the oxidation, and that develops amazing aromas and flavors which you don't usually get in the other types of tea. It's less vegetal, more floral, more fruity. Yes.
Yeah. And as you say, with oolong teas, there's so many different sorts, because you can process it for a little bit longer or a little bit less, and it's
So when people are actually buying tea, I mean, if you go into your average supermarket, you have your tea bags, and then you have your loose leaf tea by fairly well-known producers, etc. Do you think that what's being sold there, the price is reflecting fairly what's actually happening to the to how the tea's being made? And who wants to answer that first?
I find it incredible that tea is so important, and yet you can go into a supermarket and buy a tea bag for a penny or 2 pence, or even less. And when you think of where the tea has come from, and you think the love and the care and all the stuff that goes into actually making the tea and where it's actually grown, then at the factory at the tea estate, then transporting it over and everything that happens, sometimes the packaging alone will probably cost more than the tea. So I don't know, we have this thing in this country about buying tea cheaply. Yeah.
Just a very interesting note, when you buy bulk black teas from countries like Kenya, Malawi, Indonesia, etc., the price at the moment is somewhere between $2.50 a kilo and $3.50 a kilo. That has hardly crept up since the 1950s. Now that is absolutely shocking. And there's all sorts of factors. Some people, it's due in some cases to the fact that there's an oversupply of tea in the world, but tea consumption is going up, not here, but it is going up around the world. So hopefully that will push prices up. But it is extraordinary that you can go and buy a kilo of tea at the Mombasa auctions for $2.60 or thereabouts. Whereas you can buy a beautiful black tea from China, which may cost you $100 a kilo or more. A lot more.
I was telling Nick, we regularly buy teas which cost over £1,000 a kilo, mainly from China, well, almost exclusively from China. And if you think of specialty coffee usually costs about 2 to 3 times what ordinary coffee costs. The range in tea is much more extreme. One thing I would like to talk about with cost, Joe, though, is there's a perception that the higher the cost of the tea, there's a link with what the workers are paid. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption, because there are lots of expensive teas, for example, Darjeeling's probably the best example, where people are paid on a daily rate anyway, very little. They're paid, they have perks and often homes which come in the family, but the daily wage of a Darjeeling West Bengali or a Assam picker is about it's 90 rupees, about 91 pence a day, and yet Darjeeling can be some of the most expensive specialty tea, not only in the supermarket but in a department store or somewhere like that, specialty shop like ours. And I think this is something which the tea industry has to look at, the pricing element too. I think also this issue of wages and what tea costs. We work with an Australian tea producer, no pesticide, not organically certified, but they don't use any pesticides. They use large combine harvesters to harvest, so very little labour costs. But Australia has one of the highest minimum wages in the world. It varies according to the rate, but I mean it can be as high as £11 an hour, and yet we can buy a tea from them. If we didn't ship it or buy it in the bar, if we bought it in the most economical way, it would be between £7 and £10 a kilo to buy. So it's only 3 to 5 times maximum of what the cheapest tea in the world costs, and yet somebody's being paid 100 times. 100 times. So this is going to factor, I think, in the future. We're going to have a lot more mechanicalization of inexpensive teas.
Sarah's got some very interesting insights into what's actually happening in terms of tea production and fair pricing for wages.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of the biggest challenges in the sector, and it's something that we've been working on for quite a while, and the issues that Jane and Nick have raised are absolutely true. So the prices are low here. It's very hard to get prices raised in supermarkets or this end of the supply chain, because the expectation is it's a low price product. And then the issues that we see, the issues we see on the ground are really exacerbated by the fact that these tea is often grown in countries with very, very low minimum wages. So we think of Assam in India, we think of Darjeeling, think of Malawi, where we're doing a lot of work on this issue, because it's complicated by the fact that the way wages are set in tea is at a regional level. So there's a lot of assumptions that if something's fair trade certified, or if you put enough pressure on one of the big brands to pay more, then that will lead to higher wages for workers. But that is not the case. So everybody in Assam, everybody in Malawi, everybody in Darjeeling gets the same level of pay, regardless of how much their tea costs in the market, regardless of whether they're certified. And so,
unless it's if there's small producers, or in some cases small farmers, we've deliberately gone out of the Darjeeling system, so we can with the pluckers at least increase the wages per day. So it's
yeah. So either you have to kind of get yourself out of the system because the system, is problematic, or you have to look at changing the system, and obviously there's a lot of difficulties in doing that. But that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons that we work a lot on these kind of collaborative projects. So if we can get all the all the tea companies that are part of ETP and others that aren't. So we have 40 companies, some of the biggest and some of the smaller specialty ones. We've got some of the big retailers involved. We can work with the traders. If we can work with the governments of those countries, then we can look at ways to keep the industry competitive, because the last thing we want is for wages to go up too quickly, too fast, and a lot of people to lose their jobs. But if we can find ways of keeping the industry competitive and keeping wages moving up towards what we all hope will eventually be what we want, which is a proper living wage, I do think that's one of the most fundamental challenges we're facing in the industry. And in the smallholder sector, we see some smallholders earning quite well, but there has been an increase in supply, and so then you also have some quite marginal livelihoods in the smallholder sector. So it's looking at how do we help those smallholders remain resilient to price changes, how do we help them remain resilient in the face of climate change, and in some cases how do we help them diversify. So that's, it's not simple, not a simple
thing.
thing.
In your buying as well? I mean, I know you don't buy it, but your partner.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say it's an extremely complex situation, and it's actually sometimes only when you actually go out and see the role that, say, a tea estate plays within the local community, the whole culture. We have our perceptions of how things should be, and it doesn't always equate to the way things are over there. But yes, there's definitely a disconnect between the price that is paid for tea in some areas and what a lot of people who work on tea actually receive for that. But it's not necessarily something that it isn't something that tea companies on their own can solve. As you say, even if you pay more money, the money's not necessarily going down. It's governments in the country, it's all sorts of bodies that need to get involved, as Sarah will know well, everybody knows well.
Both
Sure.
of you, one after the other.
I personally, although I respect a lot of the work they do, I would like to see the organic certification bodies and who I've spoken to, and also Fair Trade, stop certifying very low pay, because it gives an impression that it's okay, especially on the supermarket shelves. And I really don't think you should be buying an organic fair trade tea where people are paid less than £1 a day. That's just the way I feel about it. I think also there is a big question of what's happened in the world generally, because I think the tea industry has mirrored lots of other industries. I think it very much mirrors a lot of production or packers. So a lot of, I don't know about Tetley, but Tata used to be both a producer. It used to own huge amounts of estates. So did Unilever. And Unilever, to its credit, in one sense, still does. It has a lot of, it has a huge estate in Africa. But most companies that used to have this complete chain from production through to packing and marketing and sales have cut that chain, and I think it's for the same reasons that clothing manufacturers have done it. I think they know that it's going to bring out issues that are controversial. They know there are going to be worker wage, worker condition issues, and they don't want to deal with that. They would rather blame it on, in one sense, a subcontractor. So I think this is happening more and more and more. And for me, to my mind, I would like to see more integrated companies, or certainly more traceability, which is one thing which is very close to my heart, and what we've tried to do since 2008, put the maker's name and the place on all our teas, including our blends. UTZ, which is a certification body, does it for all their coffee. You can take a code, it's a little bit obscure, but you can type it into the UTZ site and know exactly where your coffee came from. Tea, unlike most other things, is way behind coffee, way behind wine, way behind other things, and hopefully it will change.
I just wanted to add to everything that's been said, but from the point of view of what actually happens once the tea's here, being blended by the big companies, because I think you should be aware that if a company, any big company, has a blend recipe, into which they may be putting Assams, Kenyans, Malawi, teas, etc., maybe some Indonesian. If the price in one of those origins goes up by a tiny amount, they will go looking at a cheaper origin to see if they can buy the teas they need to replicate the flavour profile that they're looking for their blend. Now that actually sort of works against everything we've been saying. We're trying to put prices up, but if we put prices up, the company who's buying those teas will just shift somewhere else, exactly as Tim said with the clothing industry. You go somewhere else where it's cheaper. Eventually, they won't be anywhere cheaper, so hopefully everybody will benefit. But that's what happens. And if you look at the recipes of companies that are selling so many millions of tea bags around the world all the time, and you think you're getting, you know, a standard recipe, you may notice a shift in flavour and aroma, and you're probably dead right, because they will have changed the supplying region that they're buying from. So I just think everybody needs to be aware of that, really.
So that takes us very neatly onto tea bags. I know that certainly Tim feels very strongly about tea bags. I suspect he does too.
I do too.
I brought with me a little sample for Tim to see what he thinks of that tea bag. First of all, I want to know, maybe from Jane, what the standard builder's cheap tea, what is actually in that tea bag?
May I borrow that just a moment?
Sure.
While he's examining the evidence.
It's different. Every company will have their own recipe, but it could be teas from a lot of different origins. I mean, some people say 35, it probably isn't that many, but it could be from all over.
Is it sort of chopped up and powdered? I mean, is it powdered?
It's made specifically for tea bags. In the 1930s, when the tea bag was invented in America, it demanded a lot of small particles of tea to go into the tea bag, because the machinery that was invented at that time could not handle large pieces of Japanese green that's in that bag there. And so the industry had to suddenly come up with a new way of making tea. So they invented a new machine, which is everywhere today, called the CTC machine. It stands for cut, tear and curl. It makes a tea that is chopped down into tiny particles, specifically to go into tea bags. Now, when you chop a tea up, you get you get colour and strength, but you compromise on the flavour. So paper tea bags today can only be packed, the machinery that is used to pack them can only handle small particles. And, you know, these tea bags were invented to actually create a brew that was a good competitor to instant coffee that was beginning to appear. The 1950s saw the growth of the tea bag market, was introduced here. We didn't like it much, took another 18 years or so before we really started using tea bags. But that invention of that new machine had completely revolutionised the industry.
So, Sarah, you wanted to say something about it?
Yeah, I think in terms of the blend, I think in Britain it's always, pretty much always, that the kind of standard builder's tea you get is always a mixture of East African, predominantly Kenyan, with a fair bit of Indian, and then people will add various to make up their particular blend of colour or particular style. If you look at what's sold in the continental European market, because in the organisation I work for, we do see where everybody's tea comes from, and certainly if you look at what the Dutch drink and what the Germans drink, it's much more from Asia. There's much less of the East African. I think that's a particularly British flavour, isn't it? That we always have a large amount of that Kenyan tea in our tea bags.
So Nick, did you want to have a quick word about
Maybe after Tim.
After Tim, yeah.
I think this is a Fuso bag. It's a Japanese, since it's a Japanese tea. Did you bring it back from Japan?
I did bring it back from
okay, so
Japan.
that helps me.
What's it made from then?
This is a nylon one. Tea? I don't think it is. I think it's nylon. They originally were nylon. Paper taste, like, is one of the big problems with tea in a paper cup is you've got that horrible paper cup with it, and we don't have a huge amount of milk with it, so it doesn't usually work. And same, to my mind, with tea bags, and you don't allow a flow. Whereas this, in one sense, solves some of those problems because it gives it more area to move. It gives it more area to move. I mean, only the Japanese would come over. They still mainly drink really good quality loose leaf tea, which is really what I can see is in the bag itself. And so that was the other kind of innovation, putting very good tea, which I guess is what you're going to say. You do, Nick. Teapigs does really good tea in really good tea bags.
Okay, so if we're talking about tea bags, we talked about the paper bags and the limitations of a paper bag. And we talk about loose tea, and we all love loose tea, and there's something special about loose tea because there's a whole ritual of making it. as long as you've got the time. And that's the big problem these days. Most people don't have the time, or at least they say they don't have the time. If you are paying £1,000 a kilo, you're going to make the time for it.
There's no time difference. There's just equipment difference. You're using your teapot has become a mug. I have a teapot or a tea brewer and a cup. The time difference is if I you can brew it in exactly the same time, possibly quicker.
Yeah, you probably take longer to wash up after.
No,
To clear the leaves.
I recycle and the world is a happier place.
In this country, so it's like 96% of tea is consumed in bags. That is a fact. And maybe one day we'll go back to it being 96% loose tea, which obviously it used to. It was 100% loose tea.
In the tea temple,
in
these sort of more that shape, is it?
So
But
this,
it's not, what's it made
you
from?
can put longer leaf tea. You can put proper loose leaf tea in
And
it.
is that what is now happening, basically?
That's what's happening. Yeah. And but at the end of the day, the bag's only a carrier. This is just like a wine bottle, right? And you can get cheap, nasty tea put in there, or you can get better quality tea put in there. So don't be fooled by the actual bag. It doesn't necessarily mean quality, just as like a wine bottle doesn't. You get cheap long, you get expensive fine wine. But this does enable one to put larger leaf, which tends to, if you buy the right tea, have better flavour, and you have it in a convenient format, more convenient
Do you
than.
think that then leads people to actually experimenting more with actual loose leaf tea?
I think it does lead to that.
Because they
Yeah,
develop their palate.
I think it does lead to
Because
that.
I think
Yeah.
a lot of people, tea bag users, are quite frightened of actually
Yeah.
handling normal.
And I really do
tea.
think it might be an entry level. I think we're probably doing a big favour at Tea Pigs for Tim. People will go into the bag and then progress maybe to the real ritual of using loose tea.
And do any of you know if sales of loose tea are increasing, or is it still?
I think loose leaf tea use is increasing. You're starting to see it predominantly out of the home. I think you're starting to see it in restaurants, in hotels, in cafes, and that's where the market's growing. Less so at home. I think it is growing at home, but I think it's to do with people's exposure to it outside the home, then bringing it back.
We've had customers with cafes, food service customers who upgraded from a paper tea bag to using a bag like this, one of ours. And then after a few years, they've said, do you do loose tea? And we say, yes, we do loose tea. It's exactly the same. We can sell you loose tea if you want. It's just not in the bag, because they've gone through that journey of experimenting with this, and then they want to actually offer their customers the full ritual of a nice pot, and maybe it's a glass pot, and you see the leaves swirling around inside and that. So yeah, it does work like that.
And it's cheaper.
And it's cheaper. Yeah, it's cheaper. Except sometimes the people in the cafes put too much tea or too little tea. There is a big quality thing. One other advantage of this is it's portion controlled. You've got the right amount of tea per cup.
What's a teaspoon for, Nick?
Yeah, but people don't know. I've been places where people put 3 or 4 teaspoons in because they haven't been trained properly. So,
Tea bag debates.
it works, yeah, it's true. Yeah.
The floor, if you've got any questions you want to ask, you like the correct way to make tea. I've got one here straight away.
I just wondered what your thoughts are about the English tea industry, tea that's grown in this country.
Did everybody hear that? And we wanted to know what their thoughts were on the development of the English tea in this country. Are you referring to Scotland?
No. Cornwall, Rosslyn.
Cornwall, yes.
And Scotland.
And Scotland now, yeah.
Obviously, there's been a development.
Jane, who wants to answer this then?
I'll just say, I think it's great. Yeah, if you can do it, why not? And it's good. I think you'll be a little bit careful that if you're buying a tea from an English estate, it's probably not 100% tea in that actual pack. Might only be it might be about 2 or 3%, and the rest is mixed with teas because there just isn't enough available. If it is 100%, it's going to cost a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with that, but just beware that when you're buying an English tea or a Scottish tea, maybe it's not
Jane's
all.
actually, you've tried the Scottish tea.
I have. There are 2 growers in Scotland. One of them is already commercial, but he's growing tea in a very odd way. Just dropped my. In a very odd way. So we are waiting to see what happens to the tea long term, because it takes a while for the bushes to establish themselves. But he is making a smoked white tea, which won a very prestigious award just a few days ago, which none of us can quite believe, because it's definitely not the best tea in the world. But I think what's really interesting is that since Tregothnan in Cornwall started growing tea in 1997 and harvesting in 2005, it raised people's awareness of tea. They started talking about tea in a different way. They suddenly started thinking, well, if this is the first tea in England, where did the rest come from before? And of course, then we started discussing the fact that it came from China and Taiwan and Vietnam and all the other places. The two Scottish growers, one is it's still quite experimental. Interestingly enough, she is a descendant of Robert Bruce, who found the tea plant growing in the Assamese jungle in the 1820s. So that's going to be interesting to watch. And of course, they have huge issues of climate. But if I tell you that there are also tea growers now in Canada, there's a tea garden on Vancouver Island. There are tea growers right across America in Washington State, Alabama, Oregon, New York State, California. It's a very interesting time for the industry at the moment in that people are aware that they can grow tea, are growing tea. There will be issues of price and cost, etc. But it's really an expanding and very fascinating industry at the moment.
One other advantage, if you want to visit a tea estate, you don't have to go so far.
Yeah,
And they do some great tours as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do the next question there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, regarding supply chain logistics, is tea shipped in containers in like bulk, or is it actually in bags? And also, when you store tea in warehousing, is it spoiled quite easily, or does it have to be in a temperature controlled warehouse?
Did everybody hear that? Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I can tell you that if you go to a big tea estate, you stand there and usually you see these huge hooks going round, and then you see it usually now comes in bags, not in the traditional tea chests. You still see those in brokers' windows, but it comes out in these big bags. It is stored in warehouses for a long time. I'm sure connoisseurs would say that's not particularly good for it, but it depends where you are and how it's done and how you control it. But if any of you purists would like to add to that.
It can get contaminated very easily, so it should be stored in at least an ambient temperature away from things that smell a lot, because it can absorb the odour. But yeah, it gets packed in these great big 100-kilo sacks or whatever, which are all protected inside, so the tea shouldn't get affected. The tea that we drink in this country is taken probably 2 or 3 months to get here, because it comes on a container, on a ship, from the other side of the world pretty much. So by the time it gets here, it is a dried leaf. If you taste a tea on a tea estate, when it's just been pretty much made, it tastes completely different to the tea that we're familiar with drinking here. But yeah, to taste a fresh tea, you'd have to be there, or have to be vacuum packed and produced, brought over here very differently. So already the tea is 2, 3, 4 months old. It is a dried leaf.
But it used to be 2.5 years old, back in the 17th century.
Yeah, it does change. I mean, if you're buying teas from tea estates in India, for example, they will usually courier or samples or air mail samples to you, which you'll taste, and by the time you receive it, maybe 2 months later or so, or a month and a half later. With India, it's a little bit quicker. You'll notice a change in taste. It's partly because the tea settles down, and then tea does change over a year. You can keep tasting. There are some teas which don't deteriorate, but green teas deteriorate pretty quickly, and they're usually refrigerated, often at source, and then shipped out.
So does that mean that if you were drinking like a Darjeeling second flush right now, would that be nearly a year old?
Yes, but it'd be under a year, because it's May, June from last year. By the time it's got here, yes, yeah. But a lot of beware. I mean, you want to check the year it was made in. Lots of people will sell you, and it doesn't necessarily mean you could still have a good Darjeeling second flush from not last year, but the previous year is possible, but the storage conditions would have to be good, and it would have had to be made very well so it could sort of withstand that.
Okay, then I have behind you, actually, the gentleman just behind first, and then you.
If I heard correctly, people talk about fair trade sort of non-influencing the wages on the ground. So what does fair trade actually mean then?
Okay, so I work. So my organisation works a lot with fair trade and with the other certifications, which was mentioned earlier, and Rainforest Alliance. So I mean, they're all good audit schemes in that they check the conditions on the estates and so on. But when it comes to wages in particular, what they all do is check that legal minimum wage is being paid. So that's what an audit scheme will do. And in tea producing countries, you very rarely find that the legal minimum wage is not being paid. The issue is that in some countries, as was being described, the legal minimum wage for an agricultural sector in a very poor country is extremely low. And none of the certification schemes have been able to influence that. But I think the issue is that because there's that label on the pack, and also because of some of the marketing that has gone around that, the assumption is that everything is absolutely fine. And I think partly because of the legacy of actually how the trade was established, where you've got these massive estates in some places where you've got thousands of people living on an estate, often quite isolated. I mean, the history in places like Sri Lanka and India is when they set up these estates 100 years ago. They then imported the workforce from another part of the country, or in the case of Sri Lanka, from India. And so you've got communities that are very marginalised actually, and quite apart from the rest of the region. And those are structural issues which certification schemes, even like fair trade, can't solve. But I think there's that sort of misconception that because you're paying that premium and the premium price, they must have solved that, which they haven't. So, from my perspective, it's great when they then get involved with schemes like ours, where we're trying to use everybody's influence. But the premium, and I think this is a misconception in fair trade, the premium goes on community projects. It doesn't actually affect the money that people take home in their pockets.
Can I say one thing? I think one of the big problems with fair trade is it's got itself into its own problem, or it's creating problems for itself, was that the assumption with fair trade is that it's working with smaller groups like it traditionally did with coffee, for example, which can't be a plantation system. But with tea, I believe from German pressure, they allowed the estates in, I think, tea and bananas about the same time. And there are very good estates. I've visited wonderful estates. I'm not against estates as such, but there's a sense that that's not what people perceive when they buy a fair trade tea. And they also often say guaranteeing or making sure a proper price is paid to producers. Well, that's not the same thing as being paid to workers. And it's a producer is a very fine thing. And one of the other issues I have with the global tea market is they're actually trying to expand a lot of small growers. I'm not crazy about that. Expand small producers who can control what they're paid for tea, but not small growers, because small growers can't stand up to the big multinationals. They can't say, this is the price we want to get paid. No, they're going to get sat on because bought leaf factories, you will sell me your leaf at this price, is very different from, I produce a tea, I can go to either to auction, I can sell it direct to somebody like me. That's the way. They have two options. They could still sell it to a bought leaf factory and be given a set pay, or they could produce a tea and add value to it. That's what I would like to see.
So I think there was one more question there. Yes?
I find that information about tea is almost online. It's almost like an echo chamber. There's an awful lot of kind of misinformation about tea. It's really nice to have 4 experts at our disposal. See, I wonder if is there a sort of comprehensive place where somebody could go and learn about tea?
James
My classes.
If you go to Canada, for example, or America, you've been trained to be a tea sommelier. And I feel that if if you want the tea knowledge to expand, then you need a decent education system.
I absolutely agree with you. It is very difficult, and of course people's knowledge is sporadic around the world. Canada's doing an amazing thing. They have tea classes, 150-hour courses being run in adult ed colleges. It's coming here. Watch my website. But meanwhile, you know, my masterclass puts a lot of things straight. I mean, we cover things like caffeine and brewing and how tea's made and what is a white tea, what is an oolong tea, all those things. And if you buy a copy of Tea Classified, it's not 100% correct, but it's pretty good. Okay.
I think we've probably got another time. Do you want to read? What's your question?
We were talking just about fair trade and the idea of wage being something important, and then that there are lots of other things that you need to think about too. And I know that you support the Lowell Orphanage as a charitable project, and I just wondered how many tea companies are now doing things as small charities rather than working with fair trade and big organisations that actually get benefits on the ground.
I think there's probably quite a few companies doing that, yeah, probably the smaller companies. It's something we wanted, when we set up Tea Pigs, we wanted to try and put something back into a tea growing community. So it wasn't actually tea workers, but there was an orphanage adjacent to the estate, which actually has just closed, actually, because the orphanage was in a way so successful and time had moved on that, you know, the orphans were being put back into society. It's going through quite a transition. We're still supporting disabled people there and students who are going through the university, but I think it's a more in some ways it's a more tangible thing. If you know that you are putting money into a scheme of some sort and you know where that money is going and you know where it's being spent, you know, we would get photographs back, we'd get receipts back for what the money was being spent of. To us that was more tangible maybe than saying let's put something on the box that said it's certified to say that, you know, everything's hunky-dory, because even when it's certified, it's not necessarily that. It's such a complex thing.
I think Sarah also was saying something.
I think I have mixed feelings about things like that, to be quite honest, because I think in some ways it can be really good, and I think pretty much every tea company will have some project and some CSR activity, and they'll be linked in some way to a particular country or a particular community. And sometimes that can really work because, as we've been describing, you know, there's a lot of needs in those communities, but then you also get a lot of quite patchy projects. And if they're not linked into, you know, the structures, and they're not linked into the government, or they're not linked into the wider framework, then in the end, you end up with sort of charity projects rather than, you know, changing the actual situation. So, I mean, I'm in a very different situation because my job's all around trying to get people to work together. But just to take an example, I mean, there's been so much in the news recently about the situation of women in India, as you will be aware, and tea communities are, you know, have the same kind of challenges as most other communities in issues facing particularly young women. And we've been looking for a long time about where can companies actually have a positive influence and change there. And in the end, what we did was we brought together a very big project with UNICEF, because we felt that that was the only way you could tackle both the problems at the community level. You could work with the estates to use their influence, but then you have to link that up into the governmental structures and the law enforcement agencies, because in the end you've got to have work happening at all those levels. So I'm not against those kind of projects, but I think you also have to make sure that they are linked together, and you can get a lot of duplication as well, with everybody sort of supporting their own hospital or whatever.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody, both the panel and the audience, for being so good. You have to go and try lots of very delicious teas out there, and they should be partnered with, I'm not sure if it's ginger pig, but there's some sausage roll. And also some lovely cake. I know that was
great.
And I think you should bear in mind one last thought with tea. This relates to having tea with sugar. According to Henry Fielding, love and scandal are the best sweeteners of tea. So I think you should try and go and have a lot of love and scandal downstairs. Thanks very much.
Well done. Looks good.
Temple.